Okay. So welcome everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the first lunchtime talk of this year. First time in 2 years, actually, that we're gathering in person to welcome somebody to the Arendt Center in Bard. And it's exciting. It's a small group. We're wearing masks while we're not talking, and yet I'm still really excited that we're able to recongregate as a community. So today, the occasion for this is a talk by Barbara Bechtolsheim. This is long delayed. I think we were scheduled to do this last year during when COVID shut us down. But I'm really glad you're here. Barbara is an author, translator, and teacher at the Freie Universität in Berlin. She's written on creative couples and is currently writing a book on Hannah Arendt and her husband Heinrich Blücher, who you'll hear and many of you know taught at Bard for many years and was truly a beloved teacher here. But I'm sure Barbara will tell us more about that. Welcome, Barbara. She'll talk for what, 20-25 minutes?
Well, I think it's going to be 30.
30 minutes?
I think it's going to be 35-40.
Tomorrow we'll have lunch. No, she'll talk until she talks, and then we'll have lunch, and then we'll come back and do a Q&A and discussion, and then go from there. But welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and also thank you so much for having me, inviting me to this conversation. Thank you, Thomas, for your lively correspondence that we had over the past, I believe, almost 2 years.
I was looking back, it's over 2 years, I
think.
Yeah.
So that was, that's when it all started. My research, as you already said, focus was for more than 10 years have been creative couples and the impact of their relationship on their work. And this is how I became interested in Hannah Arendt and Heinrich Blücher. In particular, there was this Hannah Arendt exhibition in Berlin, and I noticed that was very surprising to me that there was Heinrich Blücher had hardly any appearance in this exhibition. And yet for 34 years, Arendt and Blücher lived as a creative couple in their philosophical workshop, which extended into Hannah Arendt's writings and her lectures, and into Blücher's teaching at Bard and at the New School, and in his essay. I would like to share with you some thoughts of my observations on their cooperation, exemplified by the concept of freedom of thought. I take it that you are familiar with the resources by Hannah Arendt I'm going to use, which is why I start out on my little handout with listing what I quote from The Origins of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition, her speech, What Freedom and Revolution Really Mean, of 1967, and of course her essay, What is Freedom? What you might not be that familiar with, Heinrich Blücher's resources. I'm looking at 2 essays of his, which he wrote in the 40s, and which Ringo Rösner, who you know has been a fellow here, published pretty much a year ago in German and in English. Blücher wrote these essays in German in the 40s. His German was not yet fluent, and
his English was not English.
His English was not yet fluent, and somebody translated it. So, and I'm also using the transcripts of his teaching at the New School and at Bard College. My subtitle here is taken from a letter by Blücher to Arendt in the context of reflecting upon their relationship. There's this, you are no doubt familiar with this huge volume of letters, and again they come back to thinking, among various other things, about their relationship. So thinking was an integral part of that relationship. Despite all unprecedented new beginnings she and Blücher had to go through, She, Hannah Arendt, was convinced that the unequaled experience of being free to make a new beginning is a quintessential human experience. This belief in the freedom to begin was a driving force of both Arendt's and Blücher's thinking, of their acting and speaking. This is why I decided to choose freedom of thought as the title of our conversation today. After a brief introduction, I would like to give you a few examples of similarities and differences of both Arendt's and Blücher's thinking, of their acting and speaking. This and how they connected, how these two terms are connected, and I hope that we get into the conversation. This quote, unequaled experience of being free to make a new beginning, as well as a few other quotes in my introduction, is taken from an untitled manuscript dated 1966-67. Arendt most likely gave this lecture at the University of Chicago, where she was teaching at the time in a school on social thought, or it could have been at the New School for Social Research, where she joined the graduate faculty in 1967. This was in the midst of revolutionary events and crises, such as the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests in this country and abroad. The increasing divide between East and West after August 13th, 1963, with its ideological battles. The Vietnam War, the horrors of the Cultural Revolution in China, and the scientific revolution of the concept of space, conquest of space, Arendt refers to in the introduction to the human condition. As usual, news about these events and their implications must have been discussed in the Arendt-Blücher household. They might have brought up memories of their own exposure to crisis and personal transformation, which they shared. When Blücher died, Arendt remembered, sometimes, very rarely, a world exists between two people. This becomes your home. At least it was the only home we were willing to accept. This tiny micro world where you can retreat from the world collapses when one of the two leaves. Arendt had been raised in Königsberg in a Jewish family of high standards, ideals, political optimism, and German literature and musical culture were a given. Thus, moral conduct was a matter of course. Blücher, 7 years older than Arendt, grew up in Berlin. His father died 4 months before he was born. His mother worked as a seamstress, so that he was exposed to a working class environment from early on. As a teenager, Arendt enjoyed the company of like-minded, ambitious, mostly Jewish friends, but also learned to stand up for her conviction. Blücher got involved in the Communist Party. While she left her hometown to study theology, philosophy, and the classics in Marburg in 1924, he was able to get his high school diploma, was drafted in 1917, and served in World War I as a military radio operator. He did not have the privilege of any formal higher education. After the war, he worked in the press department of the Foreign Office. In 1929, she married the promising intellectual Günther Stern, and they moved to Opitzstraße in Berlin-Steglitz, 1 block away from where Blücher lived, in Forststraße, Berlin-Steglitz. In 1933, both of them left Germany through Prague to Paris. They were political outcasts, she because of her Jewishness, and he on the grounds of his previous involvement with socialism and communism. They met in a cafe in Paris as German refugees in 1936. Both had lost their citizenship. They got married in January of 1940, and shortly after their marriage they were interned as foreign enemies. Luckily, they reunited in southern France. Arendt's ex-husband Günther Anders, who had immigrated to the US in 1936 and changed his name, provided affidavits so they were able to immigrate to the United States the following year. When they finally arrived in New York, they experienced freedom first and foremost as liberation from life that fear, and injustice. Both Arendt and Blücher highly appreciated the political freedom they found after their immigration. They trusted the American Constitution as guaranteeing liberty and democratic rules. In this context, they focused on raising their voice and on living a political life. America became the primary context of their philosophical and political involvement. Very soon they were surrounded by a family of mostly Jewish intellectuals, most of them writers. Hermann Broch, you all know the Hermann Broch archive here, Alfred Kazin, Mary McCarthy, Randall Jarrell, to name just a few. The New Year's parties in their Riverside apartment were legendary, as was their hospitality in the course of the year and on long weekends with friends in Palinville. It was definitely the free spirit of thinking which defined this dual monarchy, a term not very correctly introduced by their friend Randall Jarrell to describe this relationship. As much as Arendt thought of thinking as a solitary activity, the dialogue between herself and her Socrates was essential. They shared the desire for freedom, to live a political life. Both of them had a passion for public freedom. They believed in taking on responsibility through speech and deeds. Arendt concluded that in the aftermath of the American and the French Revolution, to be free and to start something new felt to be the same, end of quote. In this tradition, and with the background of their respective personal histories, she and Blücher were free to contributing to shaping the new era with their philosophical thinking. By a coincidence and through their mutual friend Alfred Kazin and Arendt's ex-husband Heinrich Blücher was able to start teaching at the New School for Social Research in New York, beginning with a course on the philosophy of culture. In the following years, he would teach courses on the sources of creative power, which became a well-received series of courses at the New School. It speaks to his intellectual ambition and competence that despite his lack of a formal academic education, Blücher was invited to go out and teach the common course for freshmen in the philosophy department here at Bard in the summer of 1952. I'm going to highlight some of their political and philosophical thoughts about freedom, or rather about the freedom to think. Since Arendt always initiated the study of her topics via a process of definition, I wish I could begin by defining both her and Blücher's notion of thinking and of freedom. However, since both freedom and thinking are such core terms for both of them, there's no easy way. Instead, I will explore the uncertainty which resonates in Arendt's opening of the essay, What is Freedom?, from an essay collection Between Past and Present, which she dedicated to Heinrich after 25 years. After the loss of authority, to raise the question, what is freedom, seems to be a hopeless enterprise. Further down in this essay, she reminds her reader that freedom of the mind is not freedom. The more we think and analyze, the more we lose the grasp of freedom. Thus, thinking leads to participating in a larger discourse and to transcending previous philosophical transitions and concepts while still acknowledging those traditions. Quote, insofar as the capacity for acting and speaking is but another mode of acting, makes us political beings, and since acting always is meant to set something in motion that was not there before, birth, human vitality, which corresponds to human mortality, is the ontological condition sine qua non of all politics, the hallmark of the world we live in. Time after time discloses to us the eruption of new beginnings within the temporal and historical continuum. End of quote. Freedom and action are tied together. So I've tried to organize this talk, the topic, into five topics, which you find on your little handout. So I'll start with independence and self-determination. In his lecture at the New School in the summer of 1952, Why and How We Study Philosophy, Blücher states, "There's only one way to freedom, and that is the way of pure philosophy, because philosophical thinking is the only human thinking concerned with freedom and truth. And to become a philosophical man is the only way to become a free man." End of quote. In his correspondence with Hannah Arendt of May 1952, he mentions how he tries to convince his students that philosophy is the path to becoming a free man. In an introductory lecture to his course at Bard College on September 25, 1953, he points out, quote, "So we always have to ask ourselves the question, what can we do? And can we do perhaps so much that we can also ask the question, what shall we do? Individual freedom implies self-knowledge to understand what one can do and to decide for oneself what is morally right to do." In his rather non-academic way, he tries to involve his students in a discourse to encourage them to think for themselves. In her essay, What is Freedom?, Arendt comes to a similar conclusion. The power that liberates, as it were, willing and knowing from the bondage to necessity is the I can. Only where the I will and the I can coincide does freedom come to pass. End of quote. Thus, reflecting about what one can do has to begin with an act of virtuosity, to bring the two together, will and willpower, while the freedom is inherent in the conviction that one is able to do this. For Arendt, thinking about freedom is connected to tradition and liberating oneself from previous ideas. Like her husband, she holds on to the traditions of philosophy, to values, in order to look at the fragments and at the lay of the land of present time. Both Arendt and Blücher are fascinated by the times of transition, the discontinuities in the continuum of history. These are the moments of new beginnings which respond to the past and correspond to the current state of social and political affairs. Arendt pointed out that natality is the quintessential human freedom. So, secondly, what I would like to look at how Arendt and Blücher analyze the limitations of freedom. First and foremost, the constituents of ideology. And such an exploration has to begin with the origins of totalitarianism. In the acknowledgements of the first edition, she writes, "This book could hardly have been written without the unpublished political philosophy of the person to whom it is dedicated. Thus, we can expect to find traces of their conversations in their writing, in particular in this book, plus in Blücher's essays on social nationalism." How did both of them describe freedom versus ideology? Arendt distinguishes between ideology and legends. Legends have been told to make sense of history, but for Arendt, they are not ideologies. In her analysis, ideologies are characterized by their quasi-scientific character. Ideologies pretend to know the mysteries of the whole historical process, the secrets of the past, the intricacies of the present, the uncertainties of the future, because of the logic inherent in their respective ideas. End of quote. Is mystery just another aspect of myth? Myths versus mysteries seem to be two sides of the same coin of the currency of power, of establishing a deductible chain of thoughts. Nationalism used a pseudo-mystical aura of lawless arbitrariness to replace the law and thereby the freedom of the people. This is the pseudo-science of history. In the introduction to his essay on National Socialism and Neo-Nationalism of 1949, Blücher asks, who twists the words in our mouths and changes our action into crime? Implicitly, he is asking who, not what, can prevent us from thinking for ourselves. Who has the power to distort good intentions? The statement was written while Blücher was still working through his communist past, which might have had an impact on the way in which he tried to analyze the freedom of thought and its limitations. First and foremost, he notices that ideology is the opposite of free thinking, and some elements in ideologies can be used.
There's so much noise.
Some elements in ideologies can be used by total imperialism, which is why he addresses the false spirit of knowing better and, most important, of its mythical elements. From Blücher's point of view, the myths of class and race are the means of ideologies which gave the masses a sense of power. This myth and its power can be embodied by a leader, such as the Nazis, who took the freedom to think and to feel responsible away. The myth, as Blücher describes it, is tied in with the fetish. Race and class serve as abstract tokens or symbols of mythical power. And as fetishes, they are not real, but they serve as the magic of those in power. As a total imperialist fetish, it must find a way to destroy human freedom at the roots. Thus, Blücher highlights the destructive quality of the cults and ideologies. In implicitly referring to Nietzsche, these constructions blur the clarity of thought and destroy the integrity of human beings. Arendt, just as Blücher, holds that racism or race thinking is an example of the strategies of promoting an ideology and pretending to be scientific. She reminds us that race thinking, by which she means a concept that was to explain national feelings versus otherness, did exist. It proved to be a powerful help to racism. Race is a prominent example of how an ideology is constructed. Race is a term, an idea, which brings along a certain logic. Whatever happens has to follow this pseudo-scientific strictness, which is a Blücher term. As Blücher puts it in his essay of 1943, Perpetual Motion, the blood thus became for the uneducated people as well as for so-called intellectuals, the philosopher's stone. And in the next passage he concludes, former ideologies through their inherent denial of human freedom had eliminated or at least weakened the activity of their adherents. Nazism eliminated like other ideology the element of human freedom, and it even did that in a more thorough manner than any previous ones. But it produced at the same time a substitute for the loss of freedom, giving an indefinite field for action to individual arbitrariness. Consequently, one might conclude both of them are highly skeptical of scientism and of the loss of traditional values to the degree that evil can become the goal and center of an ideology. Later in The Human Condition, Arendt will return to this skepticism by referring to the Sputnik shock. She fears that science might go beyond human dimensions and thereby out of control. Both of them conclude that nationalism and by implication racism lead to an atomization of the society into structuralist masses. So Blücher. Arendt. The truth is that the masses grew out of the fragments of a highly atomized society. Even though individual loneliness is balanced out by belonging to the masses, paradoxically, this mass phenomenon brings about a lack of true social relationships. This cannot be the space for dialogue. The difference between Arendt and Blücher in their line of thought is the detailed examples and proofs Arendt gives in her poetic narratives, whereas Blücher seems to summarize her arguments as he's looking for new weapons. He is still the political activist who wants to gain insight into the methods of ideology. 5 years after Blücher's death, Arendt followed up on their joint explorations of ideology. In a talk she gave at the Boston Bicentennial Forum on May 20th, 1975. Former Senator Joe Biden, at the time member of the Committee on Foreign Relations, wrote a letter to Miss Hannah Arendt asking for a copy of this paper after reading about it in the New York Times. The paper would be published in the New York Review of Books on June 26, 1975, under the title Lying as a Way of Life. And in the course of the talk, she comes to the conclusion that these lies were quite successful in countries under totalitarian rule. In totalitarian regimes, lying is guided and strengthened by ideologies, which help totalitarian regimes in making lies believable. Ideological fictions, such as the conspiracy of Jews controls world politics, are circulated by a coherent narrative. Such lies are believed as part of the myth which manipulates public opinion. They become as real and untouchable an element in their lives as rules of arithmetic. Quote, when the facts come home to roost, they let us try at least to make them welcome. Let us not try to escape into some utopias, images, theories of sheer follies. It was the greatness of this republic to give due account to the best and the worst in men, all for the sake of freedom. End of quote. In other words, freedom is not the purpose of politics, but rather its means. It is only in the public space that freedom can appear. Now I will move on to breaks in history and new beginnings. She is the historiographer who collects and structures and analyzes the fragments of history to prepare a new beginning. Arendt juxtaposes individualization and isolation with belonging and men acting together. Beginning before it becomes a historical event is the supreme capacity of men. Politically, it is identical with men's freedom. Blücher thinks about new beginnings in building his analysis and narratives on cultural figures, on the great thinkers of the past whose lives were important in times of crises or transition, such as, for example, Socrates, Zarathustra, Jesus, Buddha. They made the discovery of human freedom, of human productivity, and all of them were carriers, as Jesus is called, of happy tidings. In the spring of 1967, Blücher focused on the pursuit of truth in education. In his first Common Course lecture at Bard that year, titled Academic Freedom, he challenges the political environment which impinges upon the human ability to gain the freedom to pursue truth. He claims that to be an academic means to be a free person. This freedom has to be guaranteed, or we had better all give up. I'm not only concerned with the keeping up of the academy, which is self-evident, but I'm also concerned that it should not be replaced by conscious lying. End of quote. Instead, he insists on the responsibility that goes along with higher education. Quote, everything we do involves an ethical and moral decision. We have to regain that freedom. End of quote. Arendt had a rigorous and thorough training as a philosopher, and yet her philosophical thinking was aimed at practical and political speaking and acting. By contrast, Blücher, who never had a serious academic education and learned to be an activist in the communist and Marxist movement, decided to be a self-made philosopher. His teaching at Bard and at the New School was based on philosophy, and the goal was to educate students, young and old, to become free individuals, independent thinkers. Now, as to principle, which already resonates with what Blücher told his students, what Blücher told us about academic training and higher education, that it has to do with a decision, moral decision, and that is already in the direction of Arendt's and Blücher's thinking about freedom as a principle. They both were aware of the end of traditions, principles, morals, and the need to look at the world with fresh eyes. Systematic thinking was not theirs. Instead, they exposed themselves to the absolute uncertainty Blücher notices in Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Camus, and Heidegger. In his lecture at the New School on September 25th, 1953, he mentions the breakdown of the assured world. He wonders whether the freedom he proposes can be reached in the first place. In his introductory notes to the Common Course 1952, he says, "But how are we free? Can we be free? How can we establish meaningful relations? How do we proceed to build a free and open world by a free and open mind if no foundations are given? It might not be realistic to reach freedom at all." Questions after questions. To go beyond traditional beliefs or metaphysics implies starting with no guidance to ask questions. And yet, Blücher also defines becoming free in the context of the tradition. In pursuing these questions, he elaborates on philosophers who leave us a certain minimum space of freedom. Wisdom presupposes such a space of freedom, a three-dimensional form to think. Consequently, Blücher proposes that we, or rather his students, look at these truly independent thinkers of Western and Eastern cultural history. He acknowledges that there were exceptional historical figures who might still give guidance and open our eyes. In 1967, he seems to have become, by 1967, seems to have become more optimistic. Everything we do involves an ethical and moral decisions. We have to regain that freedom. Positive freedom of men, namely the discovery of positive creative capability in men. Such an ethical and moral decision is not a personal decision. It must be guided by a principle that is relevant regardless of political or social circumstances. The self-knowledge that is in harmony with the principle is still based on evidence of the experience in the real world. It has to transcend thinking. For Arendt, the principle of freedom is not a logical deduction or inner motive, rather it's an outside category. The conception of freedom is thought primarily from incidents of revolutionary acting together. Freedom, or its opposite, appears in the world whenever such principles are actualized. The appearance of freedom, like the manifestation of principle, coincides with the performing arts. Men are free men as distinguished from their possessing the gift of freedom as long as they act, neither before nor after. To be free and to act are the same. When freedom appears in the world, it appears as a mode of being with its own kind of virtue and virtuosity. It is an experience of risk and uncertainty that presupposes the virtue of courage. Under this principle, both Arendt and Blücher took the liberty to confront oversimplification and convention in their writing and teaching. Independence of tradition is a crucial precondition for thinking for himself or herself in this space of freedom. That means independent but not detached from pre-described concepts or opinions. Now I come to my last point, performance. Both Arendt and Blücher were skeptical about reason as the primary way of finding the truth. Arendt's first academic teacher and first lover, Heidegger, turned to poetry, Rilke and Hölderlin, as revealing the mystery of being. And in 1935 he published a study about the origin of the work of art. In yet another attempt to set free what was too narrow in traditional philosophical thinking. Arendt used just like Heidegger, Arendt used poetry to explore and explain history and philosophy, while Blücher preferred to discuss works of art and the philosophy of art. That way, philosophical thinking was liberated from the constraint of pure logic and opened up meaningful discourse. For Arendt, of all things of thought, poetry is closest to thought. In her essay, What is Freedom?, she concludes that to be free and to perform are identical, since freedom depends on an exchange with others and takes place in the realm of the world. And now I have to refer to one of your Bard College open reading groups with Judith Butler that I thought was so exciting, where she said, "This appearance of freedom is a spectacle of a new beginning." So Judith Butler. Motivated by an inspiring principle of freedom, speaking is an enactment of thinking, which is not subjective, but rather a joint action that goes beyond the mind. Thus, freedom is similar to the performing arts, which need an audience to show their virtuosity. Blücher conceived of his lectures as performances. The seminar room was a stage, and his spectators were invited to participate. As he wrote to Hannah Arendt about his spring term at the new school, "My course on existence is over now. It was the biggest course I ever done so far. The first attempt to outline absolutely free and independent thought. It really scared them. They seemed to prefer to be the last rather than a free man." End of quote. From reading his transcripts and notes of his lectures, one can tell that he took on the persona of the respective philosopher he introduced to his students. He wanted to create an experience rather than providing information for them. It seems to be obvious that both Arendt and Blücher consider freedom as an essential trait of humankind. For Arendt, freedom is first and foremost a political concept. She explores her fragmented space between past and present as a free space of open perspective, of an awareness of the traditions which need to be re-evaluated. Blücher also values the traditions in his philosophical thinking and questioning, but his focus on freedom is more personal. It has to do with the freedom to decide for oneself and to act accordingly. His communist and social involvement are still his background and have shaped his philosophical approach. However, in his teaching, he expresses more of philosophical than a political interest, so that his concept of freedom is epistemological. It is the precondition for knowledge and understanding. This kind of thinking, and here he turns to Arendt's core belief, enables us to act, not only to think freely, which would lead us to a unity of thought and action. Ultimately, both Arendt and Blücher believe that we experience freedom in action. So thinking ends when we act accordingly, when we share our solitary thought with others through dialogue and through action, and when we take on responsibility for such acts. As a final remark, I'd like to emphasize that Arendt and Blücher were not only an intellectual couple. Their correspondence demonstrates that they had a very erotic relationship, at times very playful. Think of all the nicknames that they had for each other, the poetry they exchanged referring to their desires, and that this sensuality must have inspired both of them. In terms of creative couples, they exemplified to me how a couple can share an intellectual journey so fully and yet have independent preoccupations. In the context of my research about creative couples, I consider Arendt and Blücher as one of the most interesting. She was by far more well-known and more accomplished, and yet their mutual inspiration and support over more than 3 decades led to an amazingly long-lasting impact on their work and on our cultural history and thinking. Thank you for your attention, and I would very much look forward to your remarks, criticism, and questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Barbara.